Hello and welcome to this session on civic engagement, how town and gown must work together on future development. I'm John Morgan, Deputy News Editor at Times Higher Education. So today our panel are going to be looking at questions around whether it's a university's role to regenerate a local area, and if so, how they might achieve that, how they might partner with local authorities, and the impact all of this has, how all this is impacted by COVID and Brexit. So we'll hear from each of the panelists individually first, then we'll move on to a freer discussion, and it would also be great to have some audience questions which we can come on to towards the end of the session. So Sadie, would you be able to start us off?
Yes, thank you, John. Hello, everyone. I'm going to be coming at this from a sort of slightly commercial angle with my commercial hat on. And there's two specific directions that I'm going to take it. So the first is looking at why town needs gown, and the second is looking at why gown needs town, if I've got those the right way around. The two seem to have merged into a window of opportunity where there are mutual benefits to be had for both town and gown, if they start to work together. So focusing on why town needs gown in the first instance, we were all well aware pre-pandemic of the failing retail centres across towns and cities in the UK with the shift to online retail. What the pandemic has done is served to accelerate that pace of change, and retail repurposing is a buzzword that is more prominent than ever. But the pandemic has also given a new spotlight to alternative needs and requirements of communities and town centres and what they value in a place. There are no doubt extra challenging times ahead for the retail sector, but the solution, we feel, lies in a more diverse setting. So what that setting should be is something that Savills' Reimagining Retail paper has recently reviewed. And that looks at the scope of a wider integration of different uses across a town and city centre to facilitate sustainable repurposing. So sustainable repurposing, what does that mean? Places which are future-proofed, which are green, which offer solid investment opportunities, and which provide what communities need. So that does include a greater prominence for non-retail uses, all manner of sectors, so not just universities, education, but offices and how they might look, residential across all demographic, leisure, and the roles that all those sectors need to play in regenerating towns and cities. There's often comparisons that can be drawn between retail challenges and those lumped on universities. So the traditional retail core is viewed as an island often, and the same can often be said for a university campus. Whether it's physical or perceived barriers, it separates the university from those surrounding communities. Even when universities' estates are distributed across a campus rather than on a single location, there's often criticism that they sit isolated in that wider place. And the same can be said for an office business district. So the traditional problem is that there's been a horizontal placement of uses, and what is probably needed going forward is an integration of those uses all together. So simply saying a university sat on the edge of a town or city centre should shift itself right into the middle. That's not the sole answer. That can boost footfall, but there needs to be a more granular integration of aspects such as social impact, business partnerships, health and well-being, collaboration across public, private sector, and lifelong learning. So why does gown need town, conversely? So why is the town important for universities, and why should they continue their civic role? Well, pre-COVID and pre-pandemic, universities were starting to consider that expanded role with a greater emphasis on social impact and the ESG agenda. They were looking at opportunities to diversify income streams, to foster greater collaboration with businesses, and science and innovation parks are a good example of that, and looking at more sustainable ways to deliver their estates. All those components were already in motion, and again, that seems to have been accelerated by the pandemic. So the COVID seems to have as we emerge from COVID, there seems to be a rising opportunity and acceptance that universities would like to achieve much more with their towns and cities. And how might they do that? Well, greater accessibility, both within their existing properties and greater outreach to the surrounding community, improve collaboration with businesses and active engagement. So looking at the mutual benefits of Town and Gown, take the student experience or recruitment benefits from thriving places. In turn, those places benefit, hopefully, from graduates who want to stay and work in those locations. There are already signs that there's merging of Town and Gown starting in the UK. So last week, Gloucester University announced it had bought an empty Debenhams retail store to deliver lecture halls and a training centre with a community cultural space on the ground floor. The University of Birmingham are due to open the Exchange in Birmingham city centre, a retrofitted former bank. This is set to be a place for, and I quote, curiosity, celebration, collaboration and change, to act as a catalyst for research, teaching and engagement with wider communities. So it's already happening slowly but surely, and I'm sure many more examples of that will come as the confidence builds. So the future of a town or city centre cannot possibly fall entirely on its incumbent universities, but universities are a fundamental part of that. Nor should universities be expected to principally fund the delivery of new developments, but they can provide the key to unlocking some very interesting and sustainable mixed-use schemes.
Very much, Sadie. Can we move on to you, Jane?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this session. I completely agree with Sadie in that this is absolutely about a mutually beneficial relationship between Town and Gown. And also that I think COVID, as in so many aspects of our lives, has accelerated some of those existing trends and really enabled us to sort of think and innovate in new and exciting ways. So I think it, whilst COVID has clearly brought some huge challenges, particularly for city centres, I think there are many opportunities. In Newcastle, of course, we have two universities very close together, Newcastle University and Northumbria University. And we do work very closely together. I'm sure John will mention the work of the Civic Universities Commission, and Newcastle and Northumbria are working together on a Civic University agreement with our partners in the city. And I think, again, that's something that's been really deepened by the experience of the last year or so. I wanted to say a little bit about a specific development in Newcastle, which is Helix, which is a large what was brownfield site in the city centre of Newcastle. It's a partnership development between Newcastle University, Newcastle City Council and Legal & General. And I think in many ways, it's a really good example of the sorts of things that Sadie was talking about how you bring together different partners to benefit the city, the region, in a way that we couldn't do if we were working in isolation. So Helix as a project goes back a number of years, and the partnership itself is very well established. And I think that meant that when we were faced with the challenge of COVID and also those wider challenges, John, that you referred to, Brexit, for example, climate change, all of these things mean that we have a strong set of relationships that allow us to weather those storms and to respond very, very quickly. But as a site, Helix, I think the name Helix comes from the idea of the quadruple helix, which is how you bring together academia with industry, with the public sector, but also with local communities. And I think it's really important to make that point when we're talking about developments within the city centre. So it focuses on the idea of an urban innovation quarter in Newcastle, and it combines things like education and learning through our new teaching and learning centre. It has an urban science building that really sort of looks at ways in which you can sort of understand how new urban living can work through data. And we also have future homes. We've got about 450 resi units. So again, the point that this is about the way people live in the city. And what's interesting, I think, is the way in which people may start to come back into thinking about city living. I think thinking about some of those specific examples around the way in which we've responded to COVID is we've worked with our partners in the NHS to set up an integrated COVID hub, including an innovation lab on the site of Helix, which is going to be about how you actually understand diagnostics and therapeutics, not just for COVID, but potentially for future pandemics as well. And that's been really interesting because that's allowed us to bring together the expertise of the university with what's been needed through the public health crisis. But we've also developed that in a way which is bringing in and creating jobs for local people, which clearly is really important. We're also looking at what the kind of experience and retail offer is on that site to respond to some of the shifts in that sector that Sadie referred to as well. And I think sort of finally, just to sort of highlight that importance of engaging local communities. Helix is a site that was formerly the Newcastle brewery site, so it's close to many people's hearts as the place where Newquay Brown was brewed for many years, and before that it was a coal mine, so it's firmly rooted in the place and the sort of sense of identity in Newcastle. And as part of our programs, we're working very much with local people, and as an example of that, we've been, prior to lockdown, bringing local school children onto site to meet with some of our partners, construction, architects and so on, to understand what it might mean to have a career in these areas. So for me, I think thinking about the relationship between town and gown is absolutely about building those partnerships and thinking about how we can all bring the aspects that we have and the strengths that we have at different institutions to benefit the wider area.
Very much. John.
Yeah, thanks, John. I remembered when I was thinking about talking today, I was remembering when we started UPP more than 2 decades ago, and I seem to remember the CEO bringing in a whole host of copies of The Rise of the Creative Class by Richard Florida, and him telling us to go away and read them, and we did. And you know, in The Rise of the Creative Class, Florida identifies the 3 main prerequisites for creative cities, and that's bringing together the 3 T's, as he calls them. He calls it talent, the right skilled people, tolerance, the properly diverse communities, bringing in innovation, and technology, i.e. the technological infrastructure necessary to drive entrepreneurial culture. In those days, we thought that that's the business that we were in. We were all looking forward to, very sort of, you know, shiny-eyed, looking forward to the future where we were doing exactly the sort of development that we're talking about today. And I think probably if I look back, I think in the UK there has been some sort of movement in this direction, but not as much as maybe we thought a couple of decades ago. So in terms of the question of the university's role to regenerate local area, and are they in a position to do that? I suppose the easy answer is clearly it's not their central mission or their unique role, but they're undoubtedly critical as civic actors, and particularly where they're anchor institutions. There's some good examples of universities getting more involved where that is the case. And arguably, you could argue that universities do more than their fair share, because there's what they do as part of their core mission, and then there's other things that they do to engage with their local area. So, you know, in terms of their core mission, it's to educate, provide opportunities for social mobility, employability, business incubation, research and innovation, and of course the sort of material impacts of student spending on local communities. But then, of course, there's the extra engagement that universities do in the wider civic sphere. And when we set up the UPP Foundation in 2016, we were struck at the time that the universities were facing a host of challenges with politicians and commentators from all sides asking about the fundamental purpose of universities. And we wanted to look at how concretely universities could serve their places as well as play a global role. And to do this, as some of you will know, we set up the Civic University Commission in 2018, I think it was, and of which Newcastle University was a very important part, and Jane and Professor John Goddard were a very important part of that. And what we did was we went out in a sort of a rolling select committee, and we heard evidence sessions in Manchester, Nottingham and Sheffield. And we also ran some city poll across a number of university cities to test public attitudes. In the final report, which was published in February 2019, the report highlighted that there was a lot of civic engagement, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for universities getting involved in having a more civic role. However, the Commission found few examples where this was done in a systematic and strategic approach, and particularly in the area of regeneration. One which actually was based on analysis of the needs of place. And so the Commission proposal was therefore that those universities that wanted to go beyond just civic engagement took a more formalised approach in the form of civic university agreements, which you may well have heard of. And so 60 universities, more than 60 universities signed up to civic university agreements. And what we found was that there was an incredible willingness from the public that universities should be more involved in local economic regeneration, but also that universities, I mean, we feel that universities are in a position to be a critical actor and a long-term partner. I suppose the question for me is what type of capacity do universities have to be a driver of regeneration with all the other calls being made on them, and what I suppose is the commercial imperative, what's if you like the burning platform. I was interested by the theme of whether COVID and Brexit has placed pressure on universities to get more involved more readily. And I suppose for me, the short answer is yes. I think the post-COVID build back will put more pressure on universities to be centrally involved in local initiatives. But I think if they're going to do so, they need to do so relatively quickly, because I think we're actually at a pivotal moment. As you won't be surprised, I would say that if universities are going to get more involved in regeneration, then the partnership, be it civic or more directly economic, is typically the most effective way of doing so. And in that context of Brexit and COVID, it's proved quite interesting, because obviously, being openly in the Remain camp arguably put some universities in the opposing camps to those people who arguably required the most levelling up. But I think in general, COVID has seen universities reacting readily and with quite a lot of imagination. And it's not just about, although it is, it's not just about evidencing the power of science research in terms of the vaccine, for example, but it's also the practical things that universities have been involved with. So, I don't know, for example, University of East London helping establish Nightingale hospitals. In fact, UPP, UUK, British Property Federation and NHS Property Services were working with the DFE, for example, to find accommodation for NHS staff. So I think it's how universities get involved which will be the critical element. So we did some polling at the early part of 2020, and we found that people living in towns and cities and villages care more about issues of housing and local NHS services and high street. However, the polling also revealed that public priorities are significantly different between regions. And so I suppose where universities are going to be involved in regeneration and levelling up, the emphasis has to be on targeted place-based funding. And I think, because Westminster politicians have good intentions, but it remains incredibly difficult for them to design national schemes or programmes to level up disparate places. So we argue that the government needs to utilise universities and those type of local institutions to really drive that agenda. So as part of our recent Levelling Up report, we found that 60% of non-graduate respondents, for example, wanted universities to play a greater role in their local economy, and 50% of the public agree that universities can and should be involved in the delivery of government services in the local area. And if you compare that to the figures for, I think it's 21% of people who think that their MPs are doing a good job, you can see that there's quite a lot of goodwill for universities to get involved. I think in terms of the conclusion of our Levelling Up report, which we published recently, we identified 5 areas which we thought all universities could focus on in terms of this engagement. One was town centre regeneration, which obviously has been touched on already this afternoon, and that's improving the physical environment of the local area, including the high street, along with other amenities, and working with other local actors to for example, support culture and entertainment facilities. Then there's jobs and economic localism. I think supporting directly or indirectly jobs in the local area for residents. Then there's boosting educational attainment in schools and for adults, of course, as part of that wider breaking out of the core mission of the university. And then there's research and development and innovation in the area, i.e. applying and implementing research into local challenges. Supporting the NHS was another thing we thought the universities could do more of, and as trainers of professional medical staff, but also in improving public health through student and other research activities. So I'll just conclude by noting that I think there really is an extra important role for universities as financial actors in generating activities. They're able to make a huge impact, and that's on the basis of their longevity and the nature of their business models. It means that they're readily able to procure long-term, long-dated institutional debt, which is historically cost-effective at the moment, and that working in a partnership with other civil bodies is a really powerful role that they can play. So, particularly attractive universities to pension funds, for whom university infrastructure transactions, they provide stable, low-risk returns. And of course, universities are still seen as investment grade rated propositions. And the means of presence for university and large-scale regeneration project I think is incredibly positive.
Thank you very much, John. I think that's sort of all very helpfully demonstrated the range of things that universities can do in terms of development, from sort of teaching space through to student accommodation, through to sort of mixed development centred on research and innovation that Jane talked about in Helix. So I wondered, do you think that post-COVID there's going to be a lot of councils really sort of encouraging universities to lead on developments as a way to stimulate local economies? And to pick up on John's point, what's the commercial imperative for universities to get involved in that? And is the sort of post-COVID economic uncertainty going to affect universities' ability to raise finance for any developments? Jane, you're the UK higher education's first Dean of Place, I think, and you work very closely with councils and used to work in a council. What do you think on any of those points?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, I mean, I came into the higher education sector, as you say, having worked in local government for a number of years. I think the answer is, in a way, yes. I think that local authorities and other partners, local enterprise partnerships, we're seeing more of the mayoral combined authorities. I think there is a kind of view that universities can and should make a contribution, and I think if we look at the national policy context, that sort of expectation is there as well. We'll have to see what comes sort of in the longer term when the review, the Auger review, sort of finally comes forward. But if you look at the budget and Build Back Better and that kind of emphasis on infrastructure, skills and innovation, universities, I think, are very well placed. But it is also true that it is, we exist to benefit society. That is at the core of our mission through our education and our research. So I think there is a sort of sense that this should be about what we do as institutions, and the things that we're seeing now emerging around a greater emphasis on knowledge exchange, but also thinking about our role as anchor institutions. John talked very powerfully about the way in which we come together in our places, and we know our places, and we're able to respond to that. I think the challenge has to be around how actually, from a national policy point of view, we can help to facilitate and incentivize that kind of collaborative working, and recognize that this is an important part of what we do and contribute as universities, but also that it does enhance our research and the experience of our students. And I think, you know, increasingly the Office for Students, I think, is seeing that experience of our students, where they come from, and how we can create opportunities for more students, the experience whilst they're with us, and then what that means for their future lives. It's as citizens of the world. So I think that is important. I mean, a couple of things that we haven't touched on thus far, I think, particularly are sort of, you know, that what universities can contribute in terms of our procurement policies as good employers. In Newcastle, we're the 4th largest employer actually in the region, and we've recently signed up to the real living wage accreditation, and that makes a big difference to the local community. The approach that we take with our framework for local procurement, and I was talking about Helix before, that's a framework that we've developed with the Northeast universities that makes sure that there's a huge amount that goes back into the local economy. And the second point, I think, is the way in which we can help places connect to the rest of the world. And that is a really important role that we play. But again, I think this is very much about a sort of sense of enlightened self-interest, in that I think it does benefit universities on our core mission as well as the places in which we operate.
Yeah. Enlightened self-interest seems like a good way to sum things up. John, do you want to have a crack at answering the question you posed about what's the commercial imperative for universities to get involved in these kind of developments?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps if you take an external perspective on things sometimes. So if you look at how universities, are perceived externally by people like credit rating agencies, for example, they're seen as incredibly strong institutions, cornerstone institutions. They once the credit rating agencies have got their heads around what's happening with student numbers, I mean, I think the university business model remains incredibly attractive. And universities, as Jane said about their capacity to procure, also they have a capacity to bring investors into the markets, into arrangements and JVs, and actually when you talk to the large scale capital markets investors, and they love the sort of JV local development type of model, because what they see is they see a green investment. In their eyes, it's a green investment. It's a long-term investment. It's relatively low risk. You've got an anchor institution like a university that's been around for hundreds of years. You've got the strength of the local authority and or other large institutions involved in those. So I think. Is it an imperative? I mean, I think I would be careful not to say it's an imperative for universities, because they could arguably just carry on. Some of them just carry on looking after their own coffers. But I don't see how in the longer term universities can push against the tide where people want them to be more involved. Otherwise, I think they risk losing relevance if they're not careful.
Sadie, you talked about some very interesting examples of what different universities are doing in city centres in particular. Can you see pretty big appetite from councils post-COVID to bring universities in to city centres in particular? I mean, relatively speaking, university finances are pretty stable compared to how other sectors have been affected by the pandemic, so they might look like kind of some of the best bets around locally.
Well, absolutely. So if you look at how local authorities approach sort of major regenerations across town and cities, the public-private sector partnerships, JVs that John referred to, are the most successful approach. So reliant on private investment and funds to unlock the schemes, but making sure that there's the correct components of a scheme there in order to make it viable. So whether a university is involved or not, the approach and the increasing involvement of those private-public partnerships is notable. If you add into the equation an HE institution, either as a tenant, as some form in a sort of mixed-use scheme, the investment market sees the university sector as an extremely strong investment option for them. They are increasingly becoming part of models for various universities which fall outside of the typical funding of student accommodation or these sort of research and development type schemes. They are there and keen to put their own funds, not university funds, in to deliver these schemes if the universities are sat there as anchors. But clearly it's dependent on the university, what their estate plans are, what their capital projects are, what their needs and requirements are in terms of their ongoing academic and other accommodation, whether or not those capital projects have now changed post-COVID. But if there is a need and requirement, everyone's, whether it's the private sector funders or the universities, the sustainability agenda, the ESG agenda may just drive the imperatives slightly differently in how they may wish to deliver on their sort of bricks and mortar requirements. So that may be that a university is more willing to join into a sort of mixed use sustainable scheme, which is private sector funded. It doesn't need to be the university sat there with their own low cost debt position driving it forward, because the appetite is there from the wider market to deliver it.
What do you think the potential pitfalls are for universities thinking about these kinds of potential developments? What would be the risks that they would need to consider and try to mitigate? If anyone wants to jump in.
I'll say something quick, then I'm sure Jane and John will contribute. But there's a question of control here, and obviously many universities like to be in control of their estate and what happens with their estate and the surrounding environment. So the place and setting of any new schemes that are coming forward are key, certainly if they're off campus and that's a new thing for an institution. It's also driven sort of by the university's sort of own business case and justification of why it's getting involved. So it needs to work from their own perspective in that respect. But if there is a clear business case, the pitfalls outside of not being controlled, maybe being a tenant paying a rent, are that there's a fundamental shift in that university's estate strategy or financial background that it can't warrant the rent. But that comes down to sort of, as I say, that upfront business case and having faith in the partners that are involved.
I think Sadie is right. I mean, in all PPPs, it really is a matter of how and to what extent you get the balance of risk sharing. So, I mean, the whole point of PPPs was supposed to be about getting the appropriate balance of putting risk in the hands of the people that can best deal with that risk. And I think obviously there are always examples where that is not always, it doesn't appear to be the case. But I think, in terms of some of the criticisms of PFI were that actually, and PFI differently from PPPs, was that risk wasn't really effectively transferred. And I guess the other thing I was thinking is it's always good to have contractor skin in the game. In your JV, more and more contractors, large sort of top tier contractors, are taking the opportunity to take a slice of equity for maybe the period of the development of whatever the asset is, and then maybe step away once the asset has been delivered, because obviously that's the risky part when you're trying to sort of deliver the asset more than at any other point in the project. So to have them there and have them with a sort of a bit of equity skin in the game is a really good way of going about getting that balance right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of technical thing, I think, about and certainly our experience on Helix, we've developed that as a sort of arm's length partnership with a separate company structure, because you have to be mindful of the charitable purposes of the university, and sometimes that, you need to think about how you sort of establish those legal and governance arrangements to ensure that you're operating correctly in terms of any restrictions that you might have in that regard. I also think the importance of being really clear about the objectives and recognizing that the different partners will be having different things that they want to get from the development. There'll be different priorities, and being very upfront with that at the beginning, so that there isn't a sort of mission drift and a sense that the university is sort of operating outside of what will support those kind of agreed objectives. And also, I think there is that wider sense of really making sure that there is that connection back into the education and research objectives of the university, and the buy-in of those key colleagues who will help drive those links in terms of the academic research expertise and the student experience. So getting that kind of wider buy-in across the university to how these regeneration schemes are adding value both to the place but to the university as well.
And we have a couple of audience questions. So, are there any experiences of local authorities viewing university involvement as an unwelcome nuisance? And if so, what are the strategies to overcome this? And another question about the students in the economic downturn. Should universities be investing in social enterprises or startups in order to support students financially? Any thoughts on either of those questions?
I was just thinking when Jane was talking, actually, that actually as part of that, enabling research, the university research to have an impact. Actually, some of the value in universities investing into those startup businesses. I think some universities do it better than others. Taking equity in startup businesses that are then still based in their community. I think that's a really good model. I think a number of universities do it. I think one really good example was, I think, Nottingham Trent University were very good in that area. So I think that's definitely something that would help.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, I was trying to wrap my brains of experiences of where sort of local authorities have just wished that the universities would back off, and I can't think of sort of immediate examples of that, because as we've discussed, in many ways, it's my experience is that local authorities are very keen to work with their local universities in these sorts of schemes, but I do think that sometimes there are sort of different drivers from a planning point of view, where I think universities have perhaps wanted to achieve something, whether that's about residential development or wider regen schemes, and that hasn't aligned with what the local authorities are trying to do. And unless you have the relationships and understand how those kind of often political drivers are being manifest in the local authority, that can lead to some quite big tensions. And of course, there's also that kind of ongoing relationship with the local authority and the universities around students and the development of residential areas and the private rented sector, and how you manage those relationships. So in my experience, that's where some of those sort of tensions come forward. But I think the point about student enterprise and spin outs is really important, and increasingly something that we're looking at. In the Northeast, we have a scheme called Northern Accelerator, which supports spin outs, which has been incredibly successful, and we're seeing more companies getting that support. We're also doing, I think, quite importantly, a lot of work with local SMEs who need to innovate. So allowing them to access expertise from within the university as small and medium-sized businesses to help them adapt to the changing requirements post-COVID, Brexit, addressing climate change and so on. And I think that's another way in which we can directly benefit local areas, as well as giving great opportunities in terms of education and research.
Yeah, just thinking about some of the points you made there, Jane, makes me think of Cambridge, my hometown, where there has been concern from some of the councils about the very big Northwest Cambridge development that Cambridge University is building, which is housing for university staff and sort of early career researchers and postgrads, and there's also a primary school there, and yeah, some councillors have seen that as kind of a bit of a university island, which isn't benefiting the wider city. So I guess that emphasises some of the points about needing to show kind of very close links with cities and regions and really work in partnership. Sadie, any thoughts on those couple of questions about sort of universities being perceived as a negative potentially, or students and startups, etc.?
I can think of a couple of examples where we've acted on behalf of universities and had a difficult relationship with the local authorities, but I'm not going to name them because I'm very conscious this is being recorded. But the difficulties generally revolve around an assumption that so if the university said we need help unlocking this site, it's got infrastructure, remediation issues, there's funding pots available to support that. There's been an assumption that why do you need help? Almost treating that university as a private business. Well, the scheme will go ahead regardless. You don't need to sort of have your handouts to us as a local authority. But if that scheme is viewed as a major regeneration scheme, will have a fundamental impact on the town, then that's an entirely different take on what that project is about. And I think there's at times a break in that understanding that what the university is doing and the impact it's having on that town isn't just solely about the sort of its own internal business, and therefore unlocking schemes and all of that has proven tricky when there is that perceived conflict between what are two trusted stakeholders. So it's an element of trust, and one which is getting better. Better all the time, but there has been issues where it has been a stumbling block.
And so how does austerity and the sort of massive impacts that's had on local authority funding, how does that sort of affect universities' ability to work with councils? Does that make it harder, or is there even more of a role for universities?
If I can jump in on that one, I really think that combination of factors, austerity we've seen, but increasingly through the impact of COVID, which we know is going to have sort of a huge impact across the country, but is also likely to exacerbate existing inequalities. My observation would be that is creating much more of a place-based and system-based thinking. You know, no one institution, whether that's a university, whether that's a local authority, whether that's the NHS, the voluntary sector, nobody can actually manage these huge challenges in isolation. And I think that, you know, what we're seeing increasingly is that sense of, if at a national level there was more flexibility to support that kind of local partnership working which responds to local areas, that would actually enable those things to happen much more easily. But we're seeing it up and down the country. I think that places are coming together. Universities are very much playing their part, but that local authorities actually, the challenges they're facing financially in terms of, and also in terms of the bandwidth of the things they have to deal with, like educational attainment, what it'll mean for a generation of kids having had this COVID experience. You know, how do we solve those challenges? It's about us coming together. And I think, you know, the challenge, I think, to government nationally is recognising that is something that needs to be supported and facilitated. And then if you can bring that together with the private sector and the voluntary sector as well, then I think you have something really powerful in place. And my sense is that the current circumstances really see us moving into a much more sort of collaborative environment.
And the government as well recently announced the Levelling Up Fund, which sort of various priority areas, and that's to be focused on infrastructure and unlocking key strategic projects across towns and cities. So there's scope there to unlock opportunities which universities can be part of, but the government is there supporting those projects that are struggling to get off the ground, and whether they're public and private sector funded or not, that's the key string in the bow now for local authorities to take a sort of review and priority on what they want to deliver next.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of other
to say that we're rapidly approaching the end of the session. So John, you've probably got about 20 seconds on that point, but it'd be great to hear some brief.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was just going to say that actually I do think it's a critical moment for universities to get involved in this type of scheme. One is because there is a cost of funding window which we may well lose in the post-COVID inflationary increase in inflation. And I think the other thing is just to say, Augur is important here because one of the basis of the sanguine view of credit rating agencies is that universities can increase the numbers of students that they want. So if student number caps maybe were put back in place, they may take a different view.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Sadie and Jane. That's been a really great discussion and really great range of different sort of expertise and insights. That's been really helpful in showing what the range of what universities can do in terms of development and what they could do in the future post-COVID when that future arrives.